March 19th, 1944. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stood on the flight deck of the carrier Zuikaku, watching the morning sun break over the Philippine Sea. His binoculars swept the eastern horizon where American task forces had been reported steaming toward the Marianas. What he saw through those lenses would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Not one carrier, not three, not even the 5 or 6 that Japanese intelligence had predicted. The silhouette stretched beyond his field of vision in both directions, a seemingly endless procession of flat-topped warships whose combined air power exceeded everything Japan possessed in its entire naval aviation force. Fuchida had led the first wave against Pearl Harbor. He understood carrier warfare better than almost any pilot in the Imperial Navy. He knew what a single American carrier could accomplish with its air group of 90 aircraft. He had studied intelligence reports detailing American carrier construction programs, but nothing in those reports, nothing in his experience, had prepared him for the sight of what appeared to be an armada of identical vessels, each displaying the same angular superstructure, the same flight deck configuration, the same massive scale that dwarfed even Japan's newest carriers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The moment represented more than a tactical surprise. It marked the instant when Japan's most experienced naval aviator confronted a truth that shattered every assumption underlying Japanese carrier doctrine. The Americans had not just built a few carriers to replace Pearl Harbor losses, they had industrialized carrier production itself, creating vessels on assembly lines with the same systematic efficiency they applied to manufacturing automobiles. What Fuchida observed through his binoculars was not a navy, but a factory's output, and that factory was still running. The Essex-Class carrier program had begun as an emergency response to Pearl Harbor, but it evolved into something unprecedented in naval history. American shipyards treated these 40,000-ton warships not as unique vessels, requiring years of careful construction, but as standardized products that could be mass-produced using modular techniques and interchangeable components. The first vessel, USS Essex herself, had been laid down in April 1941, launched in July 1942, and commissioned in December of that year. Impressive timing by traditional standards, but merely the beginning of an industrial acceleration that would redefine naval warfare. Newport News Shipbuilding, Bethlehem Steel, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, and Norfolk Navy Yard all received contracts to construct Essex-class carriers simultaneously. The design itself had been optimized for rapid production, incorporating lessons learned from earlier American carriers, while eliminating custom features that slowed construction. Standardized hull sections, prefabricated compartments, and modular machinery installations allowed multiple yards to build identical vessels without the coordination problems that typically plagued multi-site construction programs. By the spring of 1944, when Fuchida raised his binoculars off the Marianas, 17 Essex-class carriers had already been commissioned into the United States Navy. Another 7 were under construction at various yards, with additional hulls planned as the program expanded to meet Pacific theater requirements. Each vessel displaced 40,000 tons, fully loaded, measured 872 feet in length, and could sustain speeds exceeding 33 knots. More critically, each embarked an air group of 90 aircraft, including fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, supported by aviation fuel capacity, ammunition storage that sustained weeks of continuous operations. The Japanese carrier force that Fuchida served had evolved through different constraints and priorities. Japan's carriers represented individual achievements in naval architecture, vessels designed to maximize capabilities within treaty limitations and industrial constraints that prevented mass production. Akagi and Kaga had been converted from battleship and battle cruiser hulls, their flight decks added to existing structures that limited their efficiency. Soryu and Hiryu incorporated lessons from these conversions, but remained relatively small vessels displacing around 20,000 tons. Shokaku and Zuikaku, commissioned in 1941, represented Japan's pinnacle of carrier design at 29,000 tons, with air groups of 72 aircraft. The disparity in industrial approach became apparent when comparing construction timelines. Shokaku required 3 years, from keel laying to commissioning, representing the concentrated effort of Japan's limited heavy industry. Essex-class carriers were being completed in under 20 months on average, with some yards achieving even faster construction rates as production techniques matured. American shipyards had transformed carrier construction from careful craftsmanship into systematic manufacturing, applying the same industrial principles that Henry Ford had pioneered for automobiles 3 decades earlier. Japanese naval aviation doctrine had been built around the assumption of rough parity in carrier numbers with potential adversaries. The combined fleet's carrier striking force achieved devastating effectiveness at Pearl Harbor and during the Indian Ocean raids through superior pilot training, aggressive tactics, and concentration of force at decisive points. Japanese planners had calculated that American carrier production would proceed slowly, allowing Japan to maintain numerical advantage through its head start in building modern fleet carriers. Intelligence estimates suggested America might commission 3 or 4 new carriers annually, a production rate that Japanese strategic planning could accommodate. The actual American construction program exceeded these estimates by factors that Japanese industrial planners found incomprehensible. Newport News Shipbuilding launched USS Bunker Hill in December 1942 and commissioned her in May 1943, demonstrating construction timelines that violated every assumption about how long building a fleet carrier required. USS Lexington, named for the carrier lost at Coral Sea, went from keel laying to commissioning in just 16 months. USS Yorktown, replacing the carrier sunk at Midway, achieved commissioning in April 1943 after similar accelerated construction. The industrial system supporting this production surge extended far beyond the shipyards themselves. Steel mills operated around the clock, producing armor plate and structural steel to naval specifications. Machinery manufacturers delivered propulsion systems, generators, and auxiliary equipment on schedules coordinated with hull construction milestones. Aviation fuel systems, aircraft elevators, catapults, and arresting gear came from specialized suppliers whose production capacity had been expanded specifically to support carrier construction programs. The entire American industrial base had been mobilized to produce not just carriers, but the complex support systems that made modern carrier operations possible. Fuchida lowered his binoculars and turned to find Commander Yoshio Shiga, Zuikaku's air group commander, standing beside him with his own glasses trained on the American formation. Shiga's face had gone pale despite his deep tan from months of tropical operations. "How many?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying none of the confidence that had characterized Japanese naval aviation since the war's beginning. Fuchida paused before answering, mentally calculating the number of flight decks visible on the horizon. "At least 12 in visual range," he replied. "Intelligence reports suggest more beyond the horizon, supporting different task groups." The Battle of the Philippine Sea would begin within hours, but for these 2 experienced aviators, the outcome had already been determined by industrial realities they were only now beginning to comprehend. The American carriers they observed represented not just numerical superiority, but systematic advantages in logistics, damage control, pilot training, and operational sustainability that reflected fundamental differences in how the 2 nations approached naval aviation as an industrial enterprise versus a warrior tradition. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized offensive striking power, concentrating air groups for devastating first strikes that could achieve decisive tactical victories through superior pilot skill and aggressive tactics. This approach had proven devastatingly effective at Pearl Harbor, Ceylon, and during early Pacific engagements when Japanese carriers faced opponents with similar vessel counts and less experienced air crews. But the doctrine assumed that carrier battles would be decided by individual encounters between roughly equal forces, where training and tactical excellence could compensate for modest numerical disadvantages. The Essex-Class program had rendered these assumptions obsolete. American carriers operated in task groups of 4 to 6 vessels, each group deploying more aircraft than Japan's entire mobile fleet possessed. Task Force 58. The American carrier formation advancing toward the Marianas included 15 fleet carriers, organized into 4 task groups with combined air strength exceeding 900 aircraft. Japanese mobile fleet under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa counted 9 carriers embarking approximately 430 aircraft, many flown by hastily trained pilots rushed through abbreviated training programs to replace losses from previous campaigns. The numerical disparity reflected more than simple production capacity. Essex-Class carriers incorporated design features that enhanced operational effectiveness beyond their raw aircraft capacity. Deck-edge elevators positioned outside the flight deck envelope allowed simultaneous flight operations and aircraft handling, increasing sortie rates compared to Japanese carriers with centerline elevators that blocked deck operations during aircraft movement. Enhanced aviation fuel storage and larger magazines sustained longer operational periods without replenishment, while improved damage control systems and subdivision increased survivability against torpedo and bomb hits. American carriers also benefited from superior radar systems that provided early warning of incoming attacks and guided fighter intercepts with precision impossible, using visual observation alone. The combat information centers aboard Essex-Class carriers coordinated defensive fighter patrols, directed aircraft to targets, and managed returning strikes with efficiency that Japanese carriers could not match. This integration of electronics and aviation operations represented another dimension of American industrial advantage, applying technology not just to build more carriers, but to operate them more effectively than vessels dependent on visual observation and voice communication. The pilot training pipeline supporting American carrier operations had been expanded in parallel with vessel construction, creating sustainable cycles that maintained experienced aircrew levels despite combat losses. American training programs graduated pilots after approximately 18 months of instruction, including hundreds of flight hours in diverse aircraft types. Japanese training programs, constrained by fuel shortages and instructor availability, had been compressed to as little as 6 months for replacement pilots, with flight hours reduced to levels that left aviators barely competent for carrier operations, much less combat against experienced opponents. Fuchida understood these disparities intellectually from intelligence reports and operational experience, but seeing 12 Essex-Class carriers steaming in formation drove home the implications with visceral clarity. Each carrier represented not just a warship, but an entire industrial ecosystem of steel production, machinery manufacturing, aviation, fuel refining, ammunition production, and pilot training. 12 carriers meant over 1,000 aircraft, supported by tankers carrying aviation, gasoline, ammunition ships delivering ordnance, and logistics networks that sustained operations across oceanic distances. Japan possessed nothing comparable, and no prospect of building it given resource constraints and industrial limitations that prevented matching American production rates. The psychological impact of confronting this material disparity affected Japanese naval aviators at every level, from squadron pilots to senior commanders. Decades of naval doctrine had emphasized fighting spirit and tactical excellence as decisive factors in carrier warfare. Japanese pilots had trained relentlessly in gunnery, dive-bombing techniques, and torpedo attack methods, achieving skill levels that made them among the world's most dangerous aviators in 1941 and early 1942. This individual excellence had compensated for modest numerical disadvantages in early campaigns, allowing Japanese carriers to achieve lopsided victory ratios through superior pilot proficiency. But no amount of individual skill could overcome systematic disadvantages of the magnitude represented by the Essex-Class program. A Japanese pilot might be twice as skilled as his American opponent, but he flew alone against formations of 20 or 30 enemy aircraft, coordinated by radar direction and supported by unlimited ammunition and fuel. Japanese carriers might achieve perfect tactical execution, but they faced 4 or 5 American task groups simultaneously, making concentration of force impossible, while American carriers attacked from multiple directions with overwhelming numbers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The strategic planning sessions in Tokyo during the early 1944 had attempted to address these disparities through operational solutions that emphasized Japanese advantages in night operations, submarine coordination, and land-based air support. Admiral Ozawa's plan for the Philippine Sea engagement incorporated these elements, positioning Japanese carriers to strike from beyond American combat radius, while land-based aircraft from Guam and Tinian supplemented his embarked air groups. The plan assumed that Japanese technological advantages in aircraft range and pilot skill would offset American numerical superiority, allowing decisive strikes that would cripple enough American carriers to restore rough parity. These assumptions would prove catastrophically flawed within hours of the battle's commencement, demonstrating that systematic American advantages in radar, fighter direction, and pilot training had created defensive capabilities that rendered traditional Japanese carrier tactics suicidal regardless of numerical ratios or tactical planning. But standing on Zuikaku's deck in the dawn light, Fuchida could already sense the outcome. The sight of those endless flat tops steaming toward the Marianas represented not just ships, but the industrial might of a nation that had transformed carrier production from careful naval architecture into assembly line, manufacturing. The battle began at dawn on June 19th, 1944, when American radar operators detected the first wave of Japanese aircraft approaching from the west at distances exceeding 100 miles. The combat information centers aboard Essex-Class carriers immediately vectored fighter patrols toward the incoming strikes, coordinating defensive responses with precision that Japanese planners had not anticipated. Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters climbed to intercept altitudes, guided by radio directions that positioned them perfectly to engage Japanese formations before they could reach the American task groups. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vrasiu launched from USS Lexington as part of the initial fighter intercept, his Hellcat's engine roaring as he climbed through scattered clouds toward the altitude where radar indicated inbound Japanese aircraft. The radio crackled with constant updates from the carrier's fighter direction officer, providing course corrections and altitude information that allowed American fighters to achieve optimal positioning for their attacks. This integration of radar, radio, and coordinated fighter tactics represented systematic advantages that Japanese formations, relying on visual observation and limited radio discipline, could not counter effectively. The first wave of Japanese aircraft consisted of 69 planes, a mixed formation of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo aircraft launched from Ozawa's carriers with orders to strike the American task groups before they could launch counterattacks. Japanese pilots had been briefed on American carrier locations based on reconnaissance reports from the previous day, but they lacked real-time updates on enemy positions or defensive dispositions. They flew toward coordinates where they expected to find American carriers, unaware that radar had detected their approach while they were still an hour from their targets. Vrasiu spotted the Japanese formation at 20,000 feet, a loose grouping of aircraft that lacked the tight defensive coordination American bomber formations maintained. He rolled into an attack approach, his 650 caliber machine guns loaded and ready, selecting a Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber as his first target. The Japanese aircraft attempted evasive maneuvers, but the Hellcat's superior speed and firepower allowed Vrasiu to close rapidly and deliver a burst that set the dive bomber's fuel tanks ablaze. The aircraft tumbled toward the ocean, trailing smoke and flames, the first of 6 Japanese planes Vrasiu would destroy, in the engagement that American pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The destruction of the first Japanese wave illustrated systematic advantages that extended beyond simple numerical superiority. American fighters benefited from radar guidance that positioned them advantageously before visual contact, allowing them to engage Japanese formations from superior altitudes with speed advantages. The Hellcat fighters themselves represented industrial achievements that Japanese aircraft manufacturers could not match, combining heavy armament, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor protection for pilots, and radios that maintained constant communication with carrier fighter directors. Japanese fighters, designed to maximize speed and maneuverability through light construction, lacked the survivability and coordination capabilities that American naval aviation had prioritized. The combat information centers coordinating American fighter defenses tracked multiple inbound raids simultaneously, vectoring fresh fighter patrols to intercept each wave while recovering and refueling aircraft from earlier engagements. This systematic approach to defensive fighter operations maintained continuous coverage around the task groups, creating layered defenses that Japanese strike groups had to penetrate through multiple fighter intercepts before reaching their targets. Japanese carriers lacked comparable coordination systems, relying instead on standing fighter patrols that operated independently without centralized direction or radar guidance. Commander Fuchida watched from Zuikaku's bridge as the first wave failed to return at scheduled times. Radio communications had been sporadic, with fragmentary reports of heavy fighter opposition before transmissions ceased. The lack of returning aircraft suggested catastrophic losses, but the magnitude of the disaster would not become clear until subsequent waves also disappeared into the defensive systems protecting American task groups. Fuchida had flown enough combat missions to understand what silence meant when strike groups failed to check in after scheduled attack times. The second Japanese wave consisted of 130 aircraft, the largest formation Ozawa could assemble from his remaining carriers. This strike included fighters from the carrier air groups, supplemented by aircraft from land bases on Guam, creating a mixed force that lacked coordinated training or common radio frequencies. The formation navigated toward American positions using outdated coordinates, unaware that Task Force 58 had maneuvered, significantly, since the previous day's reconnaissance reports. American radar detected this wave while still 90 miles from the task groups, providing ample time to position fighters for intercepts that would decimate the formation before it could locate its targets. Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Duncan launched from USS Enterprise, leading a division of 4 Hellcats assigned to intercept the incoming raid. Fighter direction vectored his formation to 25,000 feet, where they spotted the Japanese aircraft flying in loose groups without the tight formations that would have provided mutual defensive support. Duncan selected a section of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters as his initial target, diving through the formation with speed advantages that the lighter Japanese fighters could not match. His wingman followed in coordinated attacks that destroyed 3 Zeros in the first pass, scattering the formation and eliminating the fighter escort that should have protected the Duff, accompanying bombers. The Japanese bombers pressed forward despite losing their fighter protection, attempting to locate American carriers through clouds and haze that obscured visual observation. Without radar or updated position reports, many groups flew past the task groups entirely, searching empty ocean, while fuel gauges dropped toward critical levels. Those formations that did locate American ships faced additional fighter intercepts and intense anti-aircraft fire from screening destroyers and cruisers, positioned to provide layered defenses around the carriers. The few Japanese aircraft that penetrated these defenses found Essex-Class carriers maneuvering at high speed with damage control teams ready to contain hits, a far cry from the vulnerable anchored targets at Pearl Harbor. Aboard Zuikaku, Fuchida monitored radio frequencies, hoping for reports of successful attacks, but the transmissions he intercepted painted a picture of complete tactical failure. Pilots reported being unable to locate targets, heavy fighter opposition, fuel shortages forcing returns to base, and catastrophic losses that eliminated entire squadrons before they could deliver attacks. The second wave, like the first, had been destroyed by systematic defensive systems that Japanese tactical doctrine had no means to counter. Admiral Ozawa launched 2 additional strikes that afternoon, desperately attempting to achieve some success that would justify the appalling aircraft losses his mobile fleet was sustaining. The third wave of 47 aircraft met the same systematic destruction as earlier raids, intercepted by radar-directed fighters before reaching attack positions. The fourth wave, a small formation of 82 aircraft, suffered similar fates, with most aircraft shot down or forced to ditch at sea after exhausting fuel searching for American carriers they never found. By the evening of June 19th, Japanese carrier aviation had effectively ceased to exist as an operational force. Ozawa's 9 carriers had launched approximately 373 aircraft during the day's operations. Fewer than 100 returned to their carriers, and many of those were damaged beyond immediate repair. American losses totaled 29 aircraft, most from operational accidents rather than combat action. The exchange ratio demonstrated the futility of Japanese attempts to achieve tactical success through pilot skill against opponents with overwhelming systematic advantages in radar, fighter direction, coordination, and industrial support. Commander Fuchida spent that night in Zuikaku's ready room, interviewing surviving pilots about their experiences during the day's disastrous operations. Their accounts revealed the psychological impact of confronting American defensive systems that made traditional carrier tactics suicidal. Pilots described being intercepted by American fighters before reaching their targets, guided by some unseen force that positioned them perfectly for attacks. They reported radio transmissions coordinating American fighters with precision that Japanese formations could not match. They described anti-aircraft fire of intensity and accuracy that suggested radar direction rather than visual tracking. The survivors also reported seeing vast numbers of American carriers, confirming Fuchida's dawn observations that Japanese intelligence had drastically underestimated the scale of American carrier deployment. Several pilots estimated encountering 12 to 15 carriers, numbers that exceeded Japan's entire remaining carrier force. The psychological effect of this realization devastated morale more completely than combat losses. Japanese pilots had been trained to believe that fighting spirit and superior skill would overcome material disadvantages. The day's catastrophic losses demonstrated that individual courage meant nothing against opponents with systematic advantages of the magnitude represented by the Essex-Class program. Admiral Ozawa faced impossible strategic decisions as darkness fell on June 19th. His mobile fleet had been reduced to fewer than 100 operational aircraft, insufficient for meaningful offensive operations against American forces that still possessed over 800 aircraft on 15 undamaged carriers. Traditional Japanese naval doctrine emphasized aggressive counterattacks, but Ozawa recognized that launching further strikes would simply complete the destruction of his remaining air groups without achieving significant damage to American forces. He ordered his fleet to withdraw westward during darkness, hoping to preserve his carriers, even though they had been rendered combat ineffective by the loss of their aircraft and pilots. American reconnaissance aircraft located the retreating Japanese fleet late on June 20th, presenting Admiral Mark Mitchell with the opportunity to launch counterstrikes that could potentially sink multiple Japanese carriers. The range exceeded standard attack distances, requiring American aircraft to fly to the limits of their combat radius, with minimal fuel reserves for return flights. Mitchell made the decision to launch despite the risks, ordering strikes that would demonstrate another systematic advantage American carrier operations enjoyed over Japanese forces. The American strike group's launch that afternoon consisted of 216 aircraft from 11 carriers, coordinated attacks that concentrated overwhelming force against Ozawa's dispersed fleet. The formations navigated to targets using navigation techniques and fuel management procedures that Japanese pilots, with their compressed training programs, had not mastered. American dive bombers and torpedo aircraft located the Japanese carriers near sunset, pressing attacks through intense anti-aircraft fire that damaged many aircraft but failed to prevent coordinated strikes that achieved devastating results. The 10 carrier Hio took torpedo hits that ruptured her fuel tanks, triggering fires that grew beyond damage control capabilities. She sank that evening, taking down hundreds of crew and the remnants of her air group. The carriers Zuikaku, Chiyoda, and Junyo all sustained bomb damage that required extensive repairs, effectively removing them from combat operations for months. 2 fleet oilers also went down, further degrading Japan's already critical fuel supply situation. American losses included 99 aircraft, but most of these resulted from fuel exhaustion during return flights rather than combat damage. Rescue operations recovered many pilots who ditched near the task force, demonstrating another systematic advantage in American operations that prioritized pilot recovery and maintained sustainable crew replacement cycles. Fuchida survived the battle aboard Zuikaku despite the bomb hits that damaged her flight deck and killed dozens of crew. He spent the long night evacuation to Japanese bases, reflecting on the systematic destruction he had witnessed. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had not been decided by tactical errors or insufficient fighting spirit. Japan had been defeated by industrial realities that made modern carrier warfare impossible to sustain without the production capacity, training, infrastructure, and logistical systems that only America possessed. The strategic implications of the Philippine Sea defeat extended far beyond the immediate loss of carriers and aircraft. Japan's remaining carrier force had been reduced to 4 operational vessels with insufficient trained pilots to embark full air groups, even if aircraft could be produced to replace combat losses. The mobile fleet's destruction as an effective fighting force eliminated Japan's ability to contest American naval supremacy in the Western Pacific, opening the Philippines to invasion and severing the supply lines, connecting the home islands with resource areas in Southeast Asia. American forces exploited this advantage immediately, with Task Force 58 conducting raids against Japanese positions throughout the Marianas and Western Pacific with impunity. The Essex-Class carriers that had devastated Japanese naval aviation at Philippine Sea continued operating on schedules that treated the Pacific as an American-controlled lake rather than contested waters. Additional Essex-Class vessels entered service throughout late 1944 and early 1945, maintaining American carrier strength at levels that made Japanese resistance increasingly futile. The production numbers told a story of industrial disparity that Japanese planners had failed to anticipate or counter. By war's end, 24 Essex-Class carriers had been commissioned into the United States Navy, with additional hulls under construction when Japan surrendered in August 1945. These vessels formed the backbone of carrier task groups that operated from the Solomon Islands to the Japanese home islands, conducting continuous operations that would have been impossible without the systematic approach to carrier production, pilot training, and logistics support that American industry had perfected. Japan never built a single vessel comparable to the Essex-Class during the war years. The carrier, Taiho, commissioned in March 1944, represented Japan's attempt to match American carrier capabilities, but her 37,000-ton displacement and air group of 75 aircraft fell short of Essex-Class specifications. She was sunk by submarine attack during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, demonstrating that even Japan's most advanced carriers could not survive in the contested waters where American submarines operated with increasing effectiveness. The carrier Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, was torpedoed and sunk by USS Archerfish in November 1944 before she could embark her first air group, symbolizing the futility of Japanese attempts to restore carrier parity through individual vessel construction. The systematic advantages that destroyed Japanese carrier aviation at the Philippine Sea reflected fundamental differences in how the two nations approached industrial warfare. American military planning treated weapons production as an engineering problem to be solved through superior resources, systematic organization, and continuous improvement of manufacturing processes. Japanese military culture emphasized individual excellence and warrior spirit, assuming that superior training and tactical aggression could compensate for material disadvantages. This philosophical difference produced divergent approaches to carrier warfare that became increasingly decisive as the conflict progressed. Essex-Class carriers embodied American systematic thinking applied to naval aviation. The vessels themselves were designed for mass production, with standardized components, simplified construction techniques that prioritized building many adequate carriers over few perfect ones. The pilot training pipeline graduated aviators in numbers that sustained operations despite combat losses, treating aircrew as replaceable components in a larger system rather than irreplaceable warriors. The logistics networks supporting carrier operations delivered fuel, ammunition, replacement aircraft, and spare parts in quantities that sustained continuous combat operations across oceanic distances. The radar and communication systems integrated defensive and offensive operations with coordination that individual skill could not match. Japanese carrier doctrine had evolved from different premises, emphasizing concentration of force at decisive points where superior pilot training and aggressive tactics could achieve crushing victories against numerically superior opponents. This approach had proven devastatingly effective in early war engagements when Japanese carriers faced opponents with similar vessel counts and less experienced air crews. But the doctrine assumed that carrier battles would be decided by individual encounters between roughly comparable forces, where training and tactical excellence could overcome modest numerical disadvantages. The Essex-Class program rendered these assumptions obsolete by creating numerical advantages so overwhelming that tactical excellence became irrelevant. Japanese pilots might be better trained individually than their American opponents, but they faced 4 or 5 enemy aircraft for every friendly fighter, coordinated by radar systems that positioned American formations advantageously before visual contact. Japanese carriers might execute perfect tactical plans, but they confronted multiple American task groups simultaneously, making concentration of force impossible, while American carriers attacked from several directions with overwhelming numbers. Commander Fuchida returned to Japan in July 1944, aboard one of the destroyers that had evacuated mobile fleet survivors from forward bases. He spent his remaining war years training replacement pilots, though both he and his students understood the futility of their efforts. Japan lacked the fuel to provide adequate flight training, the aircraft to embark on remaining carriers, and the industrial capacity to replace combat losses at rates even approaching American production figures. The systematic advantages that had destroyed Japanese carrier aviation at Philippine Sea would repeat in every subsequent engagement, with American forces growing stronger while Japanese capabilities diminished through attrition and resource exhaustion. The final carrier operations of the Pacific War occurred during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, when Japan deployed 4 carriers as decoys to draw American forces away from the main surface engagement. The carriers embarked minimal air groups due to pilot shortages and aircraft production limitations, serving primarily as targets to sacrifice in hope of achieving tactical success elsewhere. American carrier aircraft destroyed all 4 vessels, including Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor strike force. Fuchida watched reports of Zuikaku's sinking from his training command, mourning not just the ship but the warrior tradition she represented, defeated ultimately not by superior enemy courage, but by industrial systems that made individual heroism strategically irrelevant. The German comparison that Japanese pilots drew during late war discussions of carrier operations highlighted the global nature of industrial disparities that decided the conflict. Germany never completed a single operational aircraft carrier despite beginning construction on several vessels, including the Graf Zeppelin. German naval strategy emphasized surface raiders and submarines over carrier aviation, but the failure to develop carrier capabilities also reflected industrial limitations and strategic priorities that prevented matching Allied naval aviation programs. Japan's 90 Essex-Class carrier observation often referenced German Zero carriers as shorthand for understanding how industrial capacity, rather than warrior culture, determined outcomes in modern industrial warfare. The psychological impact of confronting these industrial realities affected Japanese military culture at fundamental levels. Decades of emphasis on fighting spirit and warrior traditions had created military forces that excelled at individual combat, but lacked the systematic thinking necessary for sustained industrial warfare. The revelation that courage alone could not overcome systematic material disadvantages challenged core assumptions about how wars were won and what qualities mattered most in modern military forces. Japanese pilots who survived the war often reflected that they had been trained to fight as warriors, when modern warfare required them to function as components in complex industrial systems. American naval aviation's systematic approach extended beyond carrier construction to encompass every aspect of carrier operations, from pilot training to logistics support. The training pipeline that graduated replacement pilots sustained operations despite combat losses that would have grounded Japanese air groups within weeks. The logistics networks that delivered fuel, ammunition, and replacement aircraft to forward areas maintained continuous combat operations across oceanic distances. The maintenance organizations that repaired battle damage and conducted routine upkeep kept carriers operational at rates Japanese forces could not match. The medical facilities that treated wounded personnel and prevented disease outbreaks maintained crew effectiveness. Every element of American carrier operations reflected systematic thinking that treated warfare as an organizational challenge, requiring integrated solutions rather than opportunities for individual heroism. The final accounting of carrier aviation in the Pacific War revealed disparities that justified Japanese pilots' psychological collapse when confronting Essex-Class task forces. America commissioned 24 Essex-Class fleet carriers during the war, supplemented by 9 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls and numerous escort carriers built on merchant ship designs. Total American carrier construction exceeded 150 vessels of all types, creating naval aviation capacity that treated the Pacific as an American-controlled operating area rather than contested waters. Japan completed 7 fleet carriers and 5 light carriers during the war years, numbers that included conversions and vessels completed from pre-war hulls. The production ratio approached 15-1 in America's favor, making sustained carrier warfare mathematically impossible regardless of pilot training or tactical doctrine. Commander Fuchida survived the war and spent decades reflecting on the systematic failures that had doomed Japanese naval aviation from the conflict's beginning. His post-war writings emphasized that Japan had lost not because its pilots lacked courage or skill, but because modern warfare required industrial systems that Japan could not build or sustain. The sight of those endless Essex-Class carriers steaming toward the Marianas in June 1944 had revealed a truth that Japanese military culture had refused to acknowledge. Wars between industrial powers are decided by production capacity and systematic organization rather than warrior spirit and individual excellence. The Essex-Class program represented more than successful ship construction. It demonstrated that American industrial capacity, when mobilized for military purposes, could produce weapons systems in quantities that overwhelmed opponents, regardless of their tactical proficiency or fighting spirit. The 24 fleet carriers commissioned during the war years formed the foundation of naval power that dominated the Pacific from mid-1944 onward, conducting operations that would have been impossible without the systematic approach to design, construction, training, and logistics that American industry had perfected. Japanese pilots who encountered these task forces experienced the same psychological collapse that Fuchida had felt watching them steam over the horizon in March 1944. The realization that their training, courage, and tactical skill meant nothing against opponents with overwhelming systematic advantages destroyed morale more completely than combat losses. They had been prepared to die heroically in decisive battles where individual excellence could determine outcomes. Instead, they faced industrial systems that made individual contributions irrelevant, grinding down Japanese naval aviation through attrition that could not be sustained or replaced. The legacy of the Essex-Class program extended far beyond World War II, establishing patterns of American naval aviation that continued through subsequent conflicts and peacetime operations. The systematic approach to carrier design, construction, and operations that proved decisive against Japan became the foundation for supercarrier programs that maintained American naval supremacy throughout the Cold War and beyond. The integration of radar, communications, and coordinated fighter operations that devastated Japanese strikes at Philippine Sea evolved into computer-aided systems that managed increasingly complex air operations. The emphasis on sustainable pilot training and logistics support that allowed continuous operations across oceanic distances remained central to American naval aviation doctrine. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.